Before we dive into today's intense story, a quick reminder, over 90% of our viewers watch our videos but aren't subscribed. If you enjoy content like this, take a second to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. And if you find this story gripping, don't forget to like the video, it really helps us out. My name is Lauren, and I never imagined I'd find myself telling this story. If you had asked me a few years ago, I would have described my life as steady, perhaps even enviable by some standards. I was married to David, a software engineer who provided well, loved his routines, and rarely caused a stir. We lived in a modest but comfortable home in the suburbs, and from the outside, everything seemed in place. We had no kids yet. Though we had tried for a few years without success, that disappointment lingered quietly in the background, a silent thread that wove itself into many aspects of our marriage. For a long time, I blamed myself for that. I blamed myself for not getting pregnant, for not being more passionate, more exciting, more something. David never said those things, but silence can be loud. Over time, our marriage became something like a well-worn couch, familiar, reliable. But sagging under the weight of years and indifference, we stopped going out, stopped having long conversations, and started living more like roommates who occasionally shared a meal rather than husband and wife. It was during one of those lonely evenings, staring at my reflection in the hallway mirror, that I realized how much of myself I had let go. I barely recognized the woman looking back at me. My clothes were always practical, my hair usually pulled back in a messy bun, and my eyes lacked that spark they used to have. That night, I decided I needed a change, not for David, not for anyone else, but for me. I was tired of feeling invisible, not just to him, but to myself. The next morning, I signed up for a membership at a local fitness studio. It wasn't one of those flashy chain gyms, but a small boutique-style place that focused on personalized training and wellness. It felt more welcoming, less intimidating. When I walked in for the first time, I was greeted by a woman named Kat at the front desk and introduced to my assigned trainer, Jackson. Jackson was energetic in a calm way, if that makes sense. He had this easy smile and an attentive way of listening that immediately put me at ease. He didn't look at me like I was just another client to get through, but as someone worth his full attention. He asked about my goals, not just physical ones, but how I wanted to feel. I told him I wanted to feel strong again. That word, strong, resonated deeply. I didn't even know I was missing it until I said it out loud. Our session started 3 times a week. At first, I was awkward and self-conscious. I hadn't done anything remotely athletic in years, and everything felt foreign. But Jackson was patient, encouraging, and never once made me feel embarrassed. He gently corrected my form, celebrate my small wins, and always checked in about how I was feeling, physically and emotionally. Before I knew it, I started looking forward to those sessions, not just for the exercise, but for the way I felt afterward, clear-headed, lighter, even a little hopeful. At home, David didn't really ask about the gym, nor did he seem to notice the changes happening to me. I wasn't expecting grand compliments, but part of me hoped he'd say something. He was often buried in his laptop, headphones on, immersed in his work or YouTube rabbit holes. Our dinners were mostly silent or filled with generic conversations about news or bills. I started feeling like a background character in my own marriage. Over the next few months, Jackson and I developed a rhythm. Our conversations during breaks and training drifted from fitness goals to more personal topics. He shared that he had once been in a long-term relationship that ended because his ex had cheated on him. I opened up a little about my struggles with infertility and how it had slowly built a wall between David and me. Jackson listened without judgment, just like a friend would. There was something therapeutic about being heard by someone who wasn't trying to fix you, just accept you as you were. I started taking better care of myself outside the gym, too. I got a haircut, began cooking healthy meals, and even bought a few new clothes. Slowly, I felt like I was reclaiming parts of myself I had let go of. But with that came a growing distance between David and me. He didn't ask about my day, didn't seem curious about where I was going or who I was with. There was no jealousy, no interest, just detachment. One day, after a particularly tough session, I found myself sitting in my car in the gym parking lot, unable to drive away. Jackson had complimented me on my progress, not just physically, but emotionally. He said, You walk differently now, like you believe in yourself again. That simple comment unraveled something in me. I sat there for several minutes, tears rolling down my cheeks. It wasn't just the words, it was how he saw me, something I hadn't felt in so long. I began to question the foundation of my marriage. Was I being unfair to David, or had we both let go? Just in different ways. The guilt was there, definitely, but so was the realization that I had needs too. Emotional ones that had gone unmet for years. Around this time, Jackson started offering small gestures of kindness that went beyond the usual client-trainer dynamic. He brought me my favorite smoothie after a rough session, gave me a playlist of songs he thought I'd like, and once even waited with me when my car battery died in the parking lot. Nothing he did crossed a line, but there was a tenderness in his actions that felt different. I told myself not to read into it, but my heart had already started forming attachments I couldn't ignore. I told myself it was just a phase, that I was confusing gratitude with affection. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the full truth. The way I smiled when I got a text from him, or how my heart sped up when he said my name, I hadn't felt that way in years, not since the early days with David. Still, I hadn't acted on anything inappropriate. I hadn't crossed any lines, at least not yet, but emotionally, something was shifting fast. I started pulling away from David even more, not intentionally, but it happened nonetheless. He noticed I was more distracted, maybe even colder, but he didn't ask why. If he suspected anything, he never said so. There was one evening that stood out. I had just come home from the gym, still a little flushed from the session. David was on the couch, as usual, watching a documentary. I stood in the doorway, hesitating, needing him to see me, really see me. But when he looked up, his eyes just scanned me briefly before returning to the screen. "You're back early," he said. "Yeah," I replied, unsure of what to add. Silence. In that moment, I realized how far we had drifted, and how much I had already invested, emotionally, in someone else. That was the turning point. Though I didn't know it at the time, the beginning of something I couldn't undo, and a truth I would eventually have to face. After that quiet evening in the doorway, something inside me started to unravel. Quietly at first, then with a steady momentum I couldn't control. I went through the motions of daily life, preparing meals, folding laundry, showing up for my shifts at the local library where I worked part-time. But my mind kept drifting. Not toward fantasies or unrealistic dreams, but toward the space where I felt alive again. Those moments with Jackson at the gym. I began staying after my sessions a little longer. Nothing inappropriate happened. We would sit on the bench outside the studio, sipping protein shakes, and talking about everything from music to childhood memories. He told me about growing up in a small town with a single mom who worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. I shared stories about my college days and how I once wanted to be a writer before life settled into something more predictable. The kind of conversations David and I hadn't had in years. Those meandering, spontaneous talks that made you feel known. One afternoon, as I sat laughing at a story Jackson told me about one of his clients who mistook a kettlebell for a fancy doorstop, he looked at me with this soft, quiet expression and said, "You should laugh more. It suits you." That sentence stayed with me, not because it was romantic or suggestive. It wasn't. It was the way he said it, as if he genuinely cared about my happiness in a way that felt rare and meaningful. I didn't respond right away. I just smiled and looked away, unsure how to hold eye contact when my heart felt like it was sprinting. I started noticing the details. The way he always remembered to ask how my back felt after a deadlift session, how he'd walk me to my car without making it obvious, how he respected my boundaries but made me feel valued. It wasn't lust. It was something quieter, deeper, an emotional connection I didn't know I was starving for. At home, David remained distant. He didn't ask where I was or why I was getting home later. I tested it once. I said I was going to meet a friend for coffee after my session, and he just nodded, not even asking who. I felt hurt and strangely relieved. That mix of emotions is hard to describe. It's like being forgotten and freed at the same time. I knew I was walking a tightrope. Nothing had happened physically between Jackson and me, but emotionally, I was already halfway across the bridge. I told myself I was still a faithful wife because I hadn't broken any rules. But emotional fidelity is real, and I was bending it with every shared smile and extended conversation. Then one day, everything changed. It was a Wednesday. I remember because it rained. And I almost canceled my session, but something told me to go. When I arrived, the studio was nearly empty. Jackson greeted me like always, but something was different. He seemed more reserved. Almost cautious. We went through the session as usual, but I could feel the silence between sets stretching longer than normal. Finally, after we finished, he walked me to the bench, outside like always. But this time he didn't sit. Instead, he stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and said, "Can I ask you something, Lauren? And if I'm out of line, just tell me." I nodded, not knowing what to expect. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Are you okay? I mean, not physically. I see you pushing yourself, but emotionally, are you happy?" That question undid me. No one had asked me that in a long time. Not even David, not even myself. I looked up at him and my throat tightened. I wanted to lie, to say I was fine, but I couldn't. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I used to think I was, or that it didn't matter." Jackson nodded slowly, his eyes meeting mine in that same patient way he always had. "You matter, Lauren, your happiness matters." I didn't say anything else. I just got into my car and sat there, hands on the wheel. Heart pounding. That moment felt like crossing an invisible threshold, one I hadn't intended to reach, but now couldn't unsee. That night at home, I lay awake next to David, listening to the hum of his soft snoring. I wanted to shake him, to ask if he noticed me slipping away, but I knew he didn't, or maybe he did, and didn't know how to respond. Either way, the silence between us had become its own language, one neither of us understood anymore. Over the next week, I tried to put distance between myself and Jackson. I canceled a couple sessions and told him I was busy, though he didn't press, but avoiding him only made things clearer. It wasn't just that I liked spending time with him. I needed those moments. They reminded me of who I used to be and who I wanted to become again. I didn't want to be the woman who just let life happen to her. I didn't want to be invisible in my own marriage, a ghost moving through routines without being seen. Jackson didn't make me who I was, but he reminded me that I still existed, that I was more than just David's wife or a failed pregnancy story, or a fading figure in a shared house. Eventually, I returned to the gym, and when I saw Jackson again, I could tell he was trying to respect the space I had created. We trained, we talked less, but the warmth between us never disappeared. One afternoon, after another quiet session, he handed me a small notepad with a pen attached. "What's this?" I asked. "You once told me you wanted to be a writer," he said with a half smile. "I thought maybe you could start again, even if it's just for you." I looked down at the notepad in my hand and felt tears sting the corners of my eyes. I hadn't thought about writing in years, hadn't even remembered saying that to him, but he had remembered. That mattered more than he knew. That night, for the first time in years, I sat at our kitchen table while David watched TV in the other room, and I wrote. Just a few lines, nothing polished or profound. But it felt like taking a breath after being underwater for 2 long days. Passed and I kept writing. My sessions with Jackson continued, though always within boundaries. We never touched, never flirted, but we both knew there was something unspoken between us, a connection that lived in glances, in quiet encouragement, in shared understanding. I didn't know what it meant or where it was going, but I knew it was real. Then came the moment that forced me to confront everything. One evening, David looked up from his computer and asked, "Hey, who's Jackson?" My heart stopped. I hadn't mentioned his name at home, not once. I played it cool and replied, "He's my trainer." "Why?" He shrugged. "I saw a text pop up on your phone," he said. "Hope your knee's better, take it easy tomorrow." Sounded personal. I smiled politely. "He just checks in after sessions. It's nothing." David looked at me for a second too long. Then he nodded and returned to his screen. Nothing else was said, but I felt the shift. Maybe he finally noticed. Maybe he saw what I'd been becoming, or maybe he just realized he didn't know me anymore. I went to bed that night and stared at the ceiling, the silence between us pressing down like a weight. Something had to give. I couldn't live in that emotional limbo anymore. What happened next would change everything. I wish I could tell you that everything resolved neatly, that David and I talked through our differences, that Jackson remained a warm but distant memory, and that I came out of the experience stronger without hurting anyone, but that would be a lie. The Truth is, healing doesn't come with neat edges, and sometimes doing the right thing hurts just as much as the wrong one. After David saw the message from Jackson, a strange stillness settled between us. Not an argument, not even a question, just distance. I think he knew something was changing, even if he didn't understand exactly what, and to be honest, I didn't either. I wasn't having an affair in the traditional sense. I hadn't betrayed him physically, but emotionally, I had drifted so far that I didn't know how to find my way back. The next week, David started coming home earlier. He asked if I wanted to join him for dinner out. Once he even brought home flowers, my favorite kind, lilies, which he hadn't given me in years. I saw it for what it was, an attempt, a quiet plea, maybe even guilt. I appreciated it, but it felt like watching someone paint over a cracked wall without fixing the structure beneath. I kept writing. Every night I sat at the kitchen table with that small notepad Jackson had given me. Sometimes the words flowed. Sometimes I just stared at the page. But the act itself made me feel grounded, like I was rebuilding myself from the inside out. One Friday afternoon, Jackson asked if I wanted to grab a coffee after my session. I hesitated, but then nodded. It wasn't a date. It wasn't anything secret, just two people sharing space. We walked to a cafe 2 blocks down from the gym and sat at a table by the window. It was quiet, warm, ordinary, but nothing about how I felt was ordinary. He looked at me for a moment and said, "You've changed. You smile more now." I laughed softly. I feel like I'm finally waking up. He didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. I think he understood. Jackson had never pressured me. He was never inappropriate. That's what made it even harder. There was no villain in this story. No betrayal driven by lust or drama. Just 2 people who found each other in the quiet corners of unmet needs. Then, he said something that surprised me. "I'm thinking of leaving town." I blinked. "Leaving?" He nodded. "My mom's been having some health issues. She's in Nevada. I've been thinking about moving closer to her, maybe opening a smaller gym there." It felt like the air left my lungs. I had grown so used to his presence, his stability. The idea of him not being nearby made my chest ache. I cleared my throat. That's a big change." He shrugged. "Sometimes change is what we need, even when it's hard." I nodded, not trusting my voice. That night, I sat across from David at dinner. He was talking about work, about a new client he had taken on, and I watched him closely. Really looked at him. He wasn't a bad man. He never was, but we were 2 people who had stopped choosing each other long ago. I don't know when it happened, maybe after the miscarriage, maybe before. But it was clear now. We were roommates, not partners. I put my fork down. "David," he looked up, surprised. "Yeah, I think we need to talk," and so we did. For hours I told him everything, not in detail. Not naming Jackson beyond what he already knew, but enough to be honest. I told him I had been unhappy, that I had felt invisible, that I had found connection somewhere unexpected, but nothing had happened physically. I didn't blame him. I didn't justify myself. I just told the truth. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something I'll never forget. "I knew you were slipping away, Lauren. I just didn't know how to stop it. And part of me was afraid to try." We cried that night. Both of us. For what we had lost, for the years spent drifting, for the pieces of ourselves we had given up without realizing. In the days that followed, we didn't make any rash decisions. We went on walks. We cooked meals together. We even laughed once or twice. But the core truth remained. We had changed. And maybe, love wasn't enough if it stopped growing. Jackson left town 2 weeks later. On the day he was set to leave, I met him outside the gym. He had 2 duffel bags slung over his shoulders and he smiled when he saw me. "I wasn't sure if you'd come." "I wasn't either," I said. He handed me something, a small envelope. "You don't have to read it now." I nodded and handed him something in return. A thank you card. Inside, I had written one sentence. "You helped me remember who I am. Thank you." We didn't hug. We didn't say anything more. He just smiled one last time, turned and walked away. I opened the envelope later that night. Inside was a note, written in his neat handwriting. "You deserve to be seen, Lauren. I hope you never forget that again. Live your life loudly, even when it's quiet." I wept. Not because I had lost him, but because I had found a version of myself I thought was gone. Months passed. David and I tried therapy. We were honest. We were committed. But in the end, we decided to separate. Not with anger but with grace. We both knew that staying together just to avoid discomfort would be another form of dishonesty. We parted like old friends who had shared something important, but whose paths were now different. I moved into a small apartment across town. It was nothing fancy, one bedroom, creaky floors, a window that overlooked a park, but it was mine. I filled it with books, plants, and the sound of my own thoughts. I kept writing. I started a blog just for myself at first, sharing pieces of my story, sanitized, anonymous, but honest, and the response surprised me. Other women wrote in, women who felt invisible, women who had drifted in their marriages, women who had found friendship in unexpected places and didn't know what to call it. I wasn't alone, and neither were they. Looking back now, I don't regret what happened. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't clean, but it woke me up. It reminded me that life doesn't end at routine, that our hearts still crave connection, meaning, truth. I didn't end up with Jackson. That was never really the point. He came into my life not to complete it, but to nudge me back into my own skin, and for that, I will always be grateful. I don't know what the future holds. I'm still figuring it out, but I'm doing it with my eyes open, my heart honest, and my voice steady, and for the first time in a long time, that feels like enough.